But when you look at it from the perspective of the people working in the supply chain, no, actually it kind of sucks. One of the things that's missing from most supply chain research is actually asking the people who are affected by the supply chain.
Joining us today is Dr. Marta Pagell, a distinguished scholar in sustainable supply chain management and a full professor at University College Dublin.
I'm doing a much better job of raising the issues than I am at solving them. The solutions require some creativity.
Welcome to Survey and Beyond, the data collection podcast by Survey CTO. I'm your host, Marta Costa. Each episode brings you expert tips, tools, and insights to make data collection smarter, safer, and easier. Let's dive in. Joining us today is Dr. Marta Pagell, a distinguished scholar in sustainable supply chain management and a full professor at University College Dublin. Mark's work challenges traditional models of supply chain management and advocates for a people-centric approach that prioritizes social and ecological well-being. Today, we will explore how adopting a people-centric approach transforms data collection within sustainable supply chains. So welcome, Mark, to our podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure to join you. I'm looking forward to it.
I want to get started by setting the stage to our conversation. Your recent work, or your work, has questioned a lot of the traditional supply chain management assumptions and approaches that are usually customer-centric and prioritize economic growth. So you rather advocate for a people-centric agenda within a post-growth era. And I would love if you could define these concepts for our listeners to get started.
Okay. The people-centric part is relatively straightforward. When you look at traditional research especially in a business school or in a supply chain context, we tend to be concerned with managerial decisions and how those managerial decisions maximize firm performance. We rarely consider how those managerial decisions affect the workforce. Not never, that's occasionally involved, but typically not by supply chain scholars, the communities that the supply chain has operations in, or even society. So like one of the topics that I've done some work on is the increased use of precarious or gig work. And when you look at this from the typical supply chain discussion, a company like Uber is really cool because they only pay the people when they're working and they have lots of excess capacity and so on. But when you look at it from the perspective of the Uber drivers, that only occurs because when they don't actually have a passenger in their car, when they're sitting and waiting, Uber's not paying them, right? So you've got this dichotomy that this makes the supply chain both cheaper and more flexible. And that sounds awesome. But when you look at it from the perspective of the people working in the supply chain, no, actually it kind of sucks. The traditional taxi driver or something like that is actually, their waiting time is compensated in some way, shape, or form, right? And so that's the basic idea with the people-centric. So we move from treating people as a resource to be leveraged into maximizing firm profits to people as a stakeholder in what the firm and supply chain does, who have a right to demand things like decent work, safe work, and so on. The post-growth one is messier. So post-growth, degrowth, A-growth, when you look at the economics literature, there are a lot of different terms for this. What I like to focus on is that while we can argue about whether or not growth is inherently antithetical to trying to create sustainable supply chains and communities, what I think everyone would agree on is if you agree that we have to create more sustainable supply chains, if you agree that we have to do things about issues like climate change, the reality of that is that we need more of certain things, more renewable power generation and so on, but we need less of other things. And again, business researchers have been really bad at part of this equation. We're very good at growing an existing supply chain. So how do I make an existing fossil fuel supply chain more efficient and bigger? That's what we're awesome at. We're not very good at saying, how do I build a new supply chain? So how do I scale up that replacement? And equally, we almost never talk about, okay, so if you look at some of the fossil fuel companies, they're trying to become energy companies. So they're going to provide both renewables and fossil fuels. And ignoring whether or not you think that strategy is viable long term, in essence, that means they're doing two things at once. On one hand, they're growing this new supply chain, their supply chain of renewables. On the other hand, they have to shrink their fossil fuel supply chain, but they have to do it in a way where it continues to pay for the growing the new supply chain. Those are, well, if you're a researcher, those are really cool problems. There is, for society, they're important to tackle, which is actually kind of a lovely combination, right? And so when you add the people component to the middle of that, it's, how do you make that transition? How do you scale up and scale down in a manner that, because if you look at a lot of past technological, you know, big changes in technology in the workplace, people get left behind and only get considered after the fact, right? So, for instance, you could blame a lot of the global political unrest currently as a backlash against globalization. That globalization created winners and losers at the individual level. I don't think anyone would debate that it's been bad for the globe, right? That global well-being has increased dramatically, but there are large numbers of individuals who are actually worse off. Those are the kinds of things that we need to start considering from the beginning, not after the fact.
So on both of these concepts, the well-being of people is at the center, and there would be my focus on this conversation today. I really want to understand how making this shift of a people-centric agenda, how does that change how you collect and gather data in supply chain management? So what types of traditional data become less relevant and what new types of data should be prioritized?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So, at the general level, one of the things that's missing from most supply chain research is actually asking the people who are affected by the supply chain, right? So, we will ask managers about what decisions they made. We'll ask managers about the outcomes. We'll even interview the human resource managers about what they do with the people, but we rarely actually, at its simplest, we rarely actually ask the people working in the supply chain for their view, for their experience, for their outcomes. That's the simple way to talk about it. But then you take that to the next step, that's internal. And so most supply chain researchers do work within a company or within a supply chain. If you're looking at a company's own operations and how that affects their own workers, well, yeah, you have to ask questions of new people, but that's probably relatively straightforward. But when you start asking about the workers further up in the supply chain, that becomes really complicated. It's hard enough to get data. It's if you look at a company's direct suppliers and their suppliers, and so on, as you start going up the supply chain, getting data becomes ever more difficult. Even knowing who those suppliers might be becomes more complicated. One of the reasons companies have located their supply chains all over the world is that, that they may get lower wages, better access to resources in different places. Well, if they've outsourced for low wages, the odds that that supplier wants to talk to me calling from Ireland, probably the most expensive place on the planet at this point, about how they treat their workers and can I interview their workers, that's probably not going to happen. So it's easy to say. It also, I think the second part of your question, I think these two things then grow into each other, was about different ways of collecting data. One of the ways that we have got at sustainability issues in supply chain research has been by using secondary data. It makes a lot of sense because that secondary data should be less biased. We don't have to deal with social desirability problems and so on. But that secondary data also tends to be really limited, right? So I can get secondary data, for instance, if you're looking at companies, who operate pretty much anywhere in Europe or North America, I can get data on how frequently they have accidents and injuries, how frequently they've violated labor laws, stuff like that. Similarly, for really big companies, I can get secondary data on what they claim to do with their suppliers. But that data tends to be just for really big companies or companies operating in the highest wage parts of the world. So it doesn't really get you to the rest of the supply chain. And it doesn't get you at more nuanced issues like, are you safe at work? I can probably answer that with secondary data. Do you have a good job? That's a lot harder. Is the existence of your facility in the community you live in a net positive or net negative for that community? That's really complicated, right? That's not something that secondary data can do. And it's also probably not something you can do with large data sets, right? So even if you say, okay, I'm going to switch to surveys. Well, a survey of, what's the impact of, say, Apple relocating to India? Is that a net positive or not? And how many thousands of people do you need to survey to answer that question? Maybe thousands isn't the right answer, but you probably need, you need people who are going to work for Apple in India who will probably have positive view on it. You need for people who are selling them the land. They're probably pretty excited about it, but they also have neighbors who are probably less excited about it. You have, the government. Are these going to be good jobs or crappy jobs? Or you have all of those stakeholders. And so now you're in a position where if you want to answer that question, our traditional ways of using secondary here would be pretty, because all we'd have is GDP and do they violate local laws, right? And so now I'm almost looking at something very small sample size, but lots of depth. And I think you see these trade-offs with all of the ways that we're used to collecting data in the supply chain setting, right? So it's lovely to say, okay, well, we're going to do something qualitative, lots of detail, lots of depth, but then your sample size is 1 or 3 or 5. And for some research questions, that's just inappropriate. So I'm doing a much better job of raising the issues than I am at solving them. The solutions require some creativity. So, for instance, maybe you have to do a lot more mixed method stuff, right? So you're mixing that secondary data with primary data. Maybe you're thinking about secondary data from different sources. So rather than saying that I want to collect, data from governments, what if I can scrape Twitter or scrape Instagram of users in that local community? Or what are they actually saying about this change before and after and stuff like that, right? So you're capturing the voice of the people in the community, but you don't actually have to go to the community. You don't have to actually ask them. And so this answer gets very, very long, but the short version is we have to be a lot more creative than what we currently are doing, that most of what we currently do doesn't consider people and isn't going to be good at capturing.
And of course, because capturing the social aspect of it is already so complex that requires a complex solution, I would assume. And it's really about creating a robust system that mixes so many methodologies and approaches, like both quantitative and qualitative data, both in primary and secondary data. I completely understand that. And potentially because supply chain management is so dispersed geographically, maybe you even need to consider all the local contexts and culture and backgrounds. That has implication on how you collect data too, right?
Yeah. And, I'd been smarter. I would have started with sampling because I think one of the places we can control the best using our current tools is with the sampling, right? So when you think about those local contexts or you think about the impact on communities, we tend to sample where the data is, right? So we go to the big companies, the companies who hire our students, the companies who are reporting CompuStat, right? That's the easy data to get. But if you actually want to create sustainable systems, you should be going to very different organizations. Those organizations might be harder to find and they might not have secondary data, but because of their size and because they're probably much more local in scope, they're also probably much, it may take you more time to find them, but you can actually get that kind of depth, right? So if it's a startup that's doing something really cool, right? I don't know, it's doing fast fashion, but it's doing it in Ireland, right? It's a very high wage country, poor logistical system, but somehow they're doing fast fashion, which has to be quick and cheap. and they're doing it in that setting, understanding what they're doing and building from that, right? And that gets back to that scaling up and scaling down. What you actually want to scale up are things that either don't exist or exist in that small setting currently. And I might be able to find 10 of those, really cool sort of anachronistic startups in that fast fashion space who are doing really wild things. I might be able to collect a lot of data from each of them and achieve something very different than I would get from looking at the Zaras of the world, right? So instead of going to the data we typically collecting different data might allow us to address the question differently.
And partnerships might have also a role in it, maybe with regulatory agencies, for example, that could give you access to a specific type of data.
So the regulatory agencies, that's one of the things that's been really great for me in my career, that rather than asking them for money, I've asked them for data. And in a lot of cases, they've been really accommodating with that, and you're asking for money to collect the data. They've already collected the data. And they get data from entities we never get access to. So they make really cool partners for certain projects. In addition, social enterprises, NGOs, charities, and so on also have access to communities in a different way than the big for-profits would. So again, they can be interesting partners. And we've done some research trying to address these problems from that perspective. So and this is why I wanted to move back to sampling, because if you rethink how you sample and who you sample from, some of those data collection issues solve themselves because the organizations get smaller. There are fewer of them. They're closer together. They're actually, the right research design probably is something qualitative in depth, and you can actually do it well. As opposed to research questions that would be much more quantitative. You need the big sample size and so on.
That makes a lot of sense. If we think about this vision of a people-centric agenda, that's the goal. What do you think are the most critical areas that people from the industry, researchers, policymakers, they need to put efforts into to bridge the gap between what's being done to actually get into that ideal vision of a people-centric agenda?
If my answer starts getting too academic, stop me, because I think I can say this without all the academic jargon. But the way we currently tend to do research is we look at what's currently done. We want to create sustainable supply chains that at a minimum do no harm to the environment and society. Preferably, they have some net benefit to both. Those actual versions of sustainable supply chains currently are very hard to find. Most organizations are not sustainable. Almost no supply chains are sustainable. But the empirical mindset, of course, is to study what's there, right? That's what we start with. We start with the empirical reality. We collect the data and we reflect back on it. All right. So we do descriptive theorizing, if you will. That's the kind of classical positivist model. And that makes me very comfortable. That's how I was trained. That's how I want to view the world. But if you want to create something new, you have to move beyond that in some way, shape, or form, right? That you're looking for a different outcome. And that's, so part of the answer to that is that sampling thing, right? Part of it is probably being much more willing to say, this is the outcome that we're looking for, and maybe flipping the script. So a lot of current research is, how do I take an existing supply chain that is unsustainable but profitable and make it more sustainable without harming profits? And maybe we turn that around and we say, how do I take a supply chain that's sustainable and make it profitable? Things like that, right? But that means that we have to be much more willing to be prescriptive, to be normative, and say, this is the goal that we're working towards. And if reality doesn't yet reflect that goal, we have to help it get there. And I know that sounds nuts, right? That's not how we've been trained to do research. But if you think about it, that's what medical researchers do all the time, right? They say the goal is to cure cancer, and then they figure out how to cure cancer. They don't say we should do a lot of research on cancer cells to understand how they're managed and then try and make them better, right? And I realize I'm being a bit facetious there, but the point is that's the norm in a lot of other disciplines that you theorize, if you will, what you're trying to achieve, and then you work backwards to achieve. In business research, we tend to work in the other direction. And so there is a chance, if you will, to be more hands-on, more entrepreneurial, to do more design-based work, all of those things where we say, if we accept this is the norm, or at least we're honest, this is the norm of what I want to achieve with my research, how do I actually get organizations to this end state?
I'm curious, on a more optimistic note, are
I thought that
you?
was optimistic.
It was, it was. But I'm curious to whether you are already witnessing organizations, companies that are shifting. This is always a shift on the mindset, so it's very gradual and it takes time. But I wonder if you have practical examples of good things that are happening towards this.
That's a really good question. And it's one that I guess my 30 years of being an academic helps with, because I think about the conversation we would have had 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, we were asking questions like, is this even a concern for business? Right? Should we even be talking about this? So at the grand level, the norms have shifted, right? That today, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but one of the most optimistic things I read today in the news was a news story from Texas. And it was that the Texas legislature, which is predominantly, you would think, very conservative and very much in debt to the oil industry, rejected a number of proposals that would have made it harder to build renewables in Texas. They want to keep building renewables in Texas. They don't care about the climate change component, but they know that renewables just make business sense for them. The fact that that's happening suggests that our mindsets are shifting. They're shifting slowly. You can look at specific industries. Power generation is easy because you can see that there have been companies that have made wholesale changes. Ørsted, the big wind power company, they used to be an oil company. They're having a crappy year, but that's because of bad management, not because of what they sell. You can look at what's happened in the auto industry with electric cars. And regardless of what you think of Tesla or BYD, they have completely changed the narrative in a very short period of time. 10 years ago, Toyota, General Motors, and so on would have told you electric cars are cute, but it'll never happen. Now they're spending billions, and I think Volkswagen's estimate is 180 billion just to catch up at a more local level. And I think the more local examples might be easier to grasp. I look at one of the big issues in Ireland, two big issues in Ireland are around farming. One is it's a source of a lot of emissions. It's somewhere like 35% of the country's emissions come from mostly cows and sheep. The other issue is that the products that those farmers are creating have been so commoditized that most of them don't make much money. So they're under lots of price pressure. And the traditional way to address it has been to add ever more animals, which increases emissions and does nothing for their margins. But I think we're all aware of, you go to a restaurant and now it tells you where the produce came from. It tells you who the farmer was. And we think about that from our own perspective. Oh, I trust that food. It's probably better for me. But there's something fundamental in that that's really important for the farmer as well. The farmer can't compete on price. The farmer is small. It's in a big industry. It has lots of competitors. If it tries to compete on price, it's going to get crushed. And that's kind of what the meat industry wants for those farmers, right? When the farmer steps back and says, I'm going to grow my cows or my sheep in a fundamentally different way. Yes, it's going to be more expensive, but now I can brand it. And now people are going to pay extra for it. And you see, right? So you see this with individual farms. I think in most countries, you also see this when you look at if you look across Europe, everybody's got Aldi and Lidl now. That means in every country, the existing supermarket chains can no longer compete by being cheapest. Some of them keep trying and it goes really poorly. But others take a very different tact and say, you know what? We can't be the cheapest. In Ireland, we have it sounds like they want to be the cheapest. Their name is SuperValue. Sounds like they want to be the cheapest, but they actually compete very differently. They sell lots of very Irish products you can't get anywhere else, products that have local provenance, that are grown differently, and so on. So when a customer chooses them, and so for instance, where I live, and I can't remember if it's an Aldi or Lidl, but one of them is right next door to the SuperValue. Yet the SuperValue is just as busy as the Aldi or Lidl. In other words, lots of people are in essence choosing to pay extra for their groceries because they feel a connection to how they're created. And I think when you look at a lot of countries, you can find that equivalent to SuperValue. I don't know what the Portuguese equivalent is, but I bet it exists.
It exists, yeah. And I am one of those persons that I'm becoming more and more aware of what I buy, where it comes from, if it comes from my own country, what are the ingredients in it. So it's definitely a reality.
Right. And if, cold, hard, rational business management component of that is that allows them to compete and stay in business, right? That they're doing something that we internalize as consumers is better for the world. It's also better for them because it takes them out of that commodity competition. And it shows, of course, that they can't be dramatically more expensive or no one would shop there. So it also puts pressure on the Aldis and Lidls to at least improve what they do a little bit.
Do you have any advice that you want to leave for researchers in supply chain management?
And one of the things I'm often surprised at is the number of people who ask questions because they think it's a safe question to ask. It's the mainstream question. It's nobody's going to argue about whether or not this is important. And they avoid questions that are a bit out there or a bit novel and so on. And the risks of the novel question are obvious, right? That people might say, okay, well, why does Mark do research on safety? Why is Mark talking about post-growth? Why is he talking about people when most other people in the discipline don't? There's a flip side to this. When you do that incremental, how do I make a supply chain 1% more efficient type of research? Because it's boring. There's no nice way to say it, right? It's boring. It's incremental. The process of getting it published becomes very different and much harder. And if you're not in academic publishing, the process of getting people to read it and to care about it, because it's so boring and incremental. And again, those might be unfair word choices. Because it looks so much like what everything else looks like, to be differentiated, it probably has to be really, really good methodologically, right? A really cool, really large sample, lots of cool statistical stuff and so on. When you ask that weird question, because nobody else has asked it before, you already have an advantage that this is interesting. And now you just have to make it robust enough that they're comfortable disseminating it and readers will believe it. So you end up in this trade-off of, am I more comfortable taking the risk that people will think this topic doesn't matter? But if they do think it matters, I hate to say, let me slide, but I'm going to have more degrees of freedom for how I go about answering it. Or I want them to agree with me that the topic matters and argue with me about how I did it. I'd rather argue about the topic than the how I did it. That's been my experience. And I think in terms of getting published and read, the outcomes are probably equal, but in terms of feeling good about the research and feeling that it's meaningful and being able to use it in the classroom or use it with local industry and so on, that interesting research in weird places is a whole lot more useful in that sense, and hence a whole lot more.
I feel like this is great advice for supply chain management researchers or researchers for any other industry and sector. So thank you so much, Mark, for being here. It was a pleasure talking with you about supply chain management.
Right. Thank you for inviting me. I hope some of the advice is useful. And it's certainly people have feedback, I'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. That's a wrap on today's episode. Today, Mike and I really dug into what it means to have people-centric supply chains and live in a post-growth era, why that means a whole new approach for data collection, and the big challenges and amazing possibilities for making it all happen. If you want to find out more about Mark's work, head over to our show notes and don't miss an episode by clicking subscribe. Survey and Beyond, the data collection podcast, is brought to you by Survey CTO. To find out more about Survey CTO and how it ensures reliable, secure, and scalable data collection, visit www.surveycto.com. And make sure to search for Survey and Beyond the Data Collection Podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Survey CTO, thanks for listening.